Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this this talk by Kate Jeffery. First of all, I can't remember her name. I do beg your pardon. Sushil, yeah, is going to Sushil. That's right. He's going to say a few words about the festival, SUSFest Festival.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to you for organising it. This is the 6th year we've organised the SUSFest, and with all the COVID things, it's great that we've got so many people actually getting involved and organising things. There's over 100 events happening, so if you haven't looked on the website and looked at the programme, please do so. Sign up for ones you're interested in, go and have a flick through, see what you're inspired by. The other thing is, with all of the events, we're asking people if they would complete our feedback form, just to give us an idea what people think. And as a little incentive, there is a prize draw, and I'll stick the link to that in the chat box so you can find that. And once again, thank you, David, and everyone for running the event during SUSFest, and for all of you for coming along.
Thank you, Sushil. Yes, I'm David Mitchell. I'm chairman of Redbourne Parish Council, and and also the chair of the Redbourne Climate Action Group. And I have to say that it's thanks to Melanie Hill, really, that this has been organised. It was her idea, and obviously we're very grateful to Kate Jeffery for being our speaker tonight. If you have any questions, can you put them into the chat box, and then what I'll do at the end of the speech, at the end of the presentation, I'll read them out. So I'm now going to hand over to Kate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that works. Yes, nerve-wracking to this. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see that. Okay. So my background is actually, I'm not a climate scientist, I'm a neuroscientist. And I got involved in the climate movement a couple of years ago, about the time that the school strike movement started up and then Extinction Rebellion started up. And that coincided with some freak hot weather. And a variety of things all came together that year, sort of late 2018, that really got people starting to worry about climate change. And I started to read quite a lot about the background to it and to dig into the science, because I'm a scientist, and to look at some of the graphs. And I got more and more concerned about what I was learning. And so I joined Extinction Rebellion, and my role there was to try and communicate the science of the climate crisis to the public, and try and explain why it is that people are getting upset and piling out to the streets and protesting and all of this. So in my day job, I'm actually a behavioral scientist. I study rats, but I'm a psychologist essentially. And so I'm quite interested in the psychology of why we as a species have gotten ourselves into this mess, and why we're not solving it very well. What is it about the way that we as humans process information that means that we're failing to take the action that's needed? So in this talk, I want to talk a little bit about the climate science, and then a little bit about psychology, and to try and get a handle on what we can do to try and overcome some of the barriers that there are to change. So just to put things in perspective, this is what we're trying to protect. This is a picture that was taken by Voyager as it was making its way towards the edge of the solar system, and it turned back and looked at the Earth. You can see it with the galaxy kind of behind it, and it really is very tiny. This is our home, and it's our only home. There isn't another one. So there isn't a planet B, as some people put it. So if we make our own planet uninhabitable, then that's it for humanity. So that's kind of what's at stake. And it's becoming increasingly clear that as we expand, humans have done very well as a species. We've proliferated, we've been very successful with our intelligence, and we're doing something that many species do when they start to outgrow their habitat, which is that we're destroying our habitat. We're destroying our ecosystem. and we're taking a lot of species down with us, but ultimately we're going to take ourselves down as well. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what the big concern is. So there are a variety of concerns, you know, the sort of ecosystem destruction and deforestation and so on and so on. But the thing that's really catapulted this into a kind of immediate crisis is what's happening to the climate. So we've known about the change in climate for quite a long time, actually since the beginning of the 1800s. Physicists started to figure out why the Earth is the temperature it is. So in actual fact, if you look at how much radiation is coming onto us from the sun and how much we reflect back out again, we ought to be a ball of ice. And a French physicist called Joseph Fourier worked out that the reason we aren't is that we have this protective atmosphere around us. And in particular, it has a gas called carbon dioxide in it, which absorbs radiated heat and stops it from being reflected back out into space. And that warms the planet. So that's why we have a nice, you know, temperate climate. So as the 1800s progressed, people started to consider what was going to be the consequence of the Industrial Revolution, which began around about the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, and accelerated throughout the 1800s. And that was fueled by the discovery of fossil fuels, the vast underground reserves of oil and natural gas, and the development of machinery, which, you know, particularly the internal combustion engine, which uses fossil fuels to do work and to produce the energy that we run our civilization on. And the byproduct of the burning of fossil fuels, one of the main ones is carbon dioxide. And so people started to do the calculations about what that was going to do to the atmosphere and whether that would change the temperature of the Earth. And they started to work out, so by the end of the 1800s, they'd worked out that if we kept on going, that the Earth was going to warm up. And at that stage, they weren't too worried because the amount seemed to be small, and it was known from the study of other, you know, aspects of the climate that actually we were heading into an ice age. So people thought actually, you know, we could do with some warming. But then as the 1900s progressed and systematic measurements of the Earth's temperature began, we realized that actually the warming was accelerating. So it's an exponential curve. So what this graph shows you is two things. It shows you carbon dioxide levels, which are the black line, and global temperature, which has been synthesized from a variety of sources, and it's been overlaid. So the two scales on either side have been matched so that you can see the very parallel increase in global temperature. So normally when we talk about the Earth's temperature, we talk about how it is relative to what they call the pre-industrial baseline. So before we invented all of these machines and things, what was the Earth's temperature back then, and what were the carbon dioxide levels back then? And so that's zero, that sets the 0 point. And then you can see that we've increased both of those parameters. So in terms of temperature, we're now about 1.2 degrees or so above the pre-industrial baseline. And our carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have gone from about 280, which was the baseline, up to, so this graph goes up to 400. I have to keep adjusting this graph because I made this last year, and actually now we've just seen 418. So it's a constantly changing, constantly accelerating thing. So the thing that's very striking about this is that it's an exponential, and we all know from recent experience what an exponential curve does. It starts off slowly and it gets faster and faster and faster. And before you know it, you're in very big trouble. Now, some people, when you tell them that the climate's changing, they go, well, the Earth's climate has always changed. And that's true. So if you look back over the last 500 million years, it's changed a lot. So this graph is actually, the scale is not the same all the way across. So these vertical lines tell you where the scale changes. So this is a very zoomed in scale here. Sorry. I thought someone was saying something. So this is very zoomed out and this is very zoomed in. So that's why it changes its pattern as you go across. But you can see that there have been times in the past when it's been very hot and times when it's been cold. For about the last million years, we've been going in and out of ice ages. So in fact, we've been having quite a lot of very cold periods. And then about 12,000 years ago, we settled into quite a temperate, very steady, unusually steady climatic state, which is called the Holocene. And that's the pre-industrial baseline level that we talk about, so that green line, that's the temperature that we've enjoyed for the last 12,000 years. And during that time, we've developed agriculture, we've developed civilization, we've been able to spread out across the surface of the planet because we've not been constantly being chased by the ice. We haven't had major ice ages in the last 12,000 years. So we've really had quite a nice time, and we, can inhabit most of the Earth. There are very few regions, the poles are a little bit too cold, and some regions of the tropics are a little bit too hot, but everything else is habitable for us. So it's been very nice. Now, at the very far right here, you can see these two dots. This is the projection. The first red dot is the projection for the year 2050 for temperature. And so remember, right now we're at 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, so that's here. By 2050, it's projected that if we don't do anything, we'll be up here, and by 2100, we could be up here. So we are accelerating our way out of the Holocene, essentially. Now, the other thing about this is to note that the climate is not a self-regulating thing. So it's not something that corrects its imbalances and returns itself to stability. What it is quite the opposite. It seems to be something where if you push it too far in a particular direction, it will suddenly flip into a different state. And these ice age oscillations are a really good illustration of that, where the Earth can be warming and then a relatively small change can happen and suddenly it can be heading back into the next ice age. So climate is actually a very dynamic and unstable thing. So when we mess with it, we're messing with a very large and unstable system. And it's not at all a foregone conclusion that the Holocene that we have enjoyed is going to persist. So that's the problem. That's why climate scientists are very concerned. So we're at 1.2 at the moment. We haven't seen 2 degrees. The scale is Fahrenheit. That's why the numbers don't quite match up with what I can say. We haven't seen 2 degrees Celsius for 130,000 years, so before all of those ice ages. And the one that we're expecting to see at the end of the century, plus 4 degrees, we haven't seen for several million years. Now, one of the consequences of that is that we, as a complex ecosystem, have not adapted to those temperatures. So plants and animals and the things that we rely on for food have not adapted to those hot temperatures. They've not been around for 4 million years. So we don't know what's going to happen to our ecosystems. So there's a lot of consequences of warming that are quite concerning over and above the simple fact of warming. One of them is that there are these things called feedback loops, which means that the change that's induced by warming induces more warming. And one of the big things that climate scientists are worrying about is what's happening to the poles. So if you look at the polar regions, they're covered in ice because we are actually technically in an ice age. And the ice reflects a lot of heat. And as the ice melts, because of the industrialization and the rise in carbon dioxide, we lose a lot of the reflective surface. And that means that that region of the Earth from where the ice has been lost is now absorbing heat instead of reflecting heat. And that accelerates the warming. And in fact, when climate scientists measure what's going on at the poles, they find that there's vastly more warming at poles than there is anywhere else. So although I've said we're at 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, that's true if you average across the whole Earth. But actually what's happening in Antarctica and places like Siberia is that it's several degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, and permafrost is melting and all sorts of things are happening. Massive changes are happening in the ecosystems there. So this is a graph showing the same thing. So you can see that that ice coverage there's a seasonal variation. So in the winter, there's more ice coverage, and in the summer, there's less ice coverage. So there's a slight lag. So the peak of the summer is about July, August, and then the trough of the ice, if you like, is just a little bit past that because these things take time. But you can see that in the, sort of 50 years ago or so, we were seeing much more ice coverage than we're seeing now. So the troughs are getting much, much lower. So we're seeing large amounts of ice loss. One of the other consequences, apart from the loss of reflectiveness, is that as those regions thaw, particularly the permafrost and also the sea ice and the floor of the sea, the frozen floor of the sea. These regions contain a lot of a gas called methane, which is very much more potent than carbon dioxide as a blanketing, heat trapping, what they call a greenhouse gas. It's many times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. And there's a worry that if we warm up the poles too much and too much methane is released, that this process will start to become self-sustaining. And even if we then stopped producing our own emissions, the Earth would start producing enough of its own emissions from these locked up stores that we would get runaway climate change. Now that's theoretical. We don't know for sure that's going to happen, but just the possibility of these things is causing a lot of concern. And again, this sense that we're messing with things we shouldn't be messing with. Now we're already, even at 1.2 degrees, starting to see effects of climate change. And we had a succession of these in 2018, 2019, which, as I mentioned, is one of the reasons that people started to get very anxious and start protesting vigorously about what's going on. We had some massive flooding events. We had some massive heat waves. We had cyclones. So this was a massive cyclone in Africa. This was a heat wave in India that sent temperatures, daytime temperatures, up into the high 40s, which, if you think about it, is extremely difficult to survive. And we're now starting to see the temperature in some parts of the world go up to levels that people actually can't survive out of doors. So without air conditioning or some way of cooling, people will actually just die of simple heat. So that's starting to happen. And the regions where we see these lethal days of heat are going to increase year on year and exponentially. And we see forest fires and so on and so on. So so many climate events, are already starting to happen, and many more are forecast. And we're starting to see things happening in the UK too. So we're seeing changes in our weather patterns. We're seeing the weather becoming much wetter than we've been used to in previous decades. That has been predicted because as the Earth warms, the air can hold a lot more moisture. There's a possibility that we might actually become cooler, paradoxically, because the Gulf Stream, which is a stream of warm water that keeps us warm, stops us being as cold as we ought to be for our latitude. The Gulf Stream is weakening because of the warming at poles. And some climate models predict that it will slow down and might stop completely, in which case we, in this particular region, will see colder weather or alternatively bigger swings, like bigger peaks and bigger troughs. So it's complicated and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it is looking concerning. Now, it's hard to imagine the world not being there for us because it's always been there for us. As we live our lives, the world is just the world. It just seems like it will always carry on. But in fact, civilizations have come and gone and things have not always been stable for them. And this is a picture of a very, very well-known scenario. This is Easter Island, where the local indigenous population used to live in an island that was covered in forests, and it was very, very kind of rich and fertile. And over the centuries that they lived there, they cut down the forests to be able to farm. And eventually they cut down all of the forests. And then they were unable to sustain themselves, and then they eventually died out. And there have been numerous civilizations in the past that have come and gone, and not an insignificant number of them have died out because of ecological disasters, climate change, and inability to continue to sustain themselves. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we are always going to be able to feed ourselves. So this started to come to global attention in the 1980s when people started plotting the exponential rise and banging on the doors of government ministers and so on and saying, look, this is serious, you've got to listen to us. And in particular, there was a climate scientist in the US called James Hansen, who made a very impassioned speech to the US government and managed to galvanize some action. And what the world's governments did was form this body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what this body does is it's a non-political organization. It's made up of scientists from across the globe, and their job is to come to a consensus about the state of the climate and to make predictions about what's going to happen. And so they harvest the literature and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and they have meetings and discussion groups and seminars, and they write papers, and they really look carefully at the literature. So it's the biggest sort of scientific information harvesting exercise. And every few years they produce a report. And in 2018, they produced a very concerning report saying that if we can't limit warming to 1.5 degrees, well, for two things. One, we need to do that. And two, we are not on course to do that according to the way that we're acting at the moment. So we are going to have to make some massive changes in how we run things if we're to keep warming to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline. And if we can't do that, then the consequences are likely to be catastrophic. Now, these impassioned pleas that have been coming along every few years have had very little effect on governments. This is a compilation of some of them. So the first IPCC report came out in 1990, and then we've had various intergovernmental, big meetings and treaties and reports and more meetings and so on. And every time that there's one of these, and that they're now annual, the COP meetings are pretty much annually. Whenever they come along, they produce a lot of flurry of reportage in the news, and they produce reports, but you can see that it's not led to any kind of action that's measurable by scientists as a change in the exponential rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So, governments have agreed, and they agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015 that they were going to limit their emissions, and they set themselves targets. And they've tried very hard to meet those targets. And in fact, the UK is one of the countries that's really worked very hard in trying to meet its target, and many other countries have as well. But they're not succeeding in stemming the rise of atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's just not enough. These targets are not having the effect that they need to be having. So why is this happening? Like, why are we just letting this happen? So, a few of us are jumping up and down and getting upset, but by and large, the average person in the street, if you go and talk to them about this, they are not really particularly concerned. How do we get people to understand the need for action? So my kind of reading of the problem is that we are not evolved to deal with this type of planetary scale disaster, if you like. We evolved, 3 million years ago. We have the brains that equipped us to live in small groups on the savannah and in the forest, and we were hunter-gatherers, and we lived in communities of no more than a few dozen or at most a few hundred individuals. And our brains are equipped for dealing with the conditions that existed back then. So the major threats were from other humans, were from predators, were from a drop in our food supply, and so on and so on. We did not evolve to deal with rising atmospheric carbon dioxide. So we need to think about how to work with the psychology that we have hardwired into our brains, the thing that's written into our genes. And so it's interesting to look at that psychology and to try and understand what it is about how humans think. And so we learned some interesting things about how we think. And we think, when we consider our own perceptions and our own thoughts and so on, we tend to think that we are perceiving the world as it is out there. So we are perceiving reality, and our opinions of what's going on are real opinions. And we're really convinced of this. But it's really easy to show that our perceptions are not at all of what's out there. And this is one of my favorite examples from visual psychophysics. If you look at this checkerboard, this square that's labeled A and this square that's labeled B are both the same color. There they are there. They are both the same shade of gray. And yet, when you look at them on the checkerboard, your eye does not see that these things are the two shades of grey. It sees one as dark and one as light. It sees one as almost black and one as almost white. It's an extraordinary trick that our brains play on us. I'll just show you that again because I really love this. So there's no fading or anything going on as I move those squares. I've just shifted them to one side. There they are. My other favorite example from visual psychophysics is this, which did the rounds on social media a few years ago. Some of you might remember it. This dress, which is very obviously white and gold. But some people whose brains don't work as well see it as blue and black. Now, of course, 50% of you are going, what? It is blue and black. And then the other 50% of you are going, yeah, of course it's white and gold. The fact is 50% of people see it one way and 50% of people see it the other. So the reason for these optical illusions, if you like, is that our brains are not reporting on what our senses see. They're reporting on what they think our senses have seen, given all the other things that the brain knows. So the brain knows about checkerboards, and it knows about objects casting shadows. So what it does is it takes the raw signal, that's, the raw pixels, if you like, and it compensates for the fact that this is a checkerboard and a square that looks like it should be white is in shadow. And so it makes you see it black and white. It kind of gets rid of the shadow for you. And similarly, there's a similar thing with the dress. Eventually, psychologists figured out that what's happening is that the lighting for this dress is really ambiguous, and some people's brains interpret it one way and some people interpret it the other way. And depending on whether you think it's a dress that's in bright sunlight or in deep shadow, you see it one color or another. So we're not seeing what we think we see. The other thing is that we don't see things at all of the timescales at which they occur. So we did evolve brains to deal with predators and fast events that happen on the time scale of seconds and milliseconds. So you can dodge a tiger coming at you, you can catch a ball, but you can't really perceive very slow change. You don't notice your children growing. The classic myth about this is the frog and boiling water. The story goes that if you put a frog in cold water and slowly warm it up, the change is too slow for it to notice, and it will just sit there until it boils to death. Whereas if you place a frog in hot water, it'll jump out. So I did some hunting on the internet, and actually that's not what frogs do. They jump out of warming water as well, you'll be pleased to know. But it's a great myth, and it makes the point that we're not really sensitive to slow incremental change. We haven't noticed, for example, that the climate in England has changed quite a lot in the last 20 years. I remember 20 years ago when I moved to St Albans, we used to have several weeks of frost in November and December. That's not been happening for the last, I don't know how many years. It's stopped happening. It's quite unusual to get frost in the depths of winter. We hardly ever get snow now. We're seeing the spring flowers come out earlier and earlier. We're starting to see disjunctions between the hatching of some kinds of insects and the hatching of birds, which normally would eat those insects, because the insects are hatching earlier because of the earlier spring, but the birds are still hatching at the same time because they use a slightly different signal for their clock. And so they're arriving and there's no food for them, and so on and so on. So we're starting to see big strains on our ecosystems. So another thing is we're not very good at assessing the size and the amount of things. So we talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius, and a lot of people, including myself, don't really know what to do with that information. It doesn't sound like very much. I think of a 1.5 degree change in temperature, and I could experience that when I walked out my door into the hall. Why the big fuss about 1.5 degrees? And the reason is that we don't really perceive the consequence of that kind of change. We don't understand what that means on a planetary scale. So we don't know what to do with information about the doubling of the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere and so on. We don't know how to deal with it. And when people say we need to plant trees to soak up the carbon dioxide, they don't have an understanding of how many trees we would need to plant. And the answer is, in fact, we would need to plant more trees than we have land area for in order to soak up the collective emissions of all of the world's industrialized nations. We haven't got enough land area to plant as many trees. people don't make those equivalences because we don't really know how to do that. We're quite poor at assessing risk. So we tend to assess risk not according to actual numbers and percentages of the likelihood of losing our lives, but in terms of the salience of the event and how much impact it has on us psychologically. And a really good example of that is that the difference in responding between these two disasters that happened about 20 years ago. One was the Twin Towers attack, which killed around about 3,000 people. But it changed the course of geopolitics globally. For those people who remember that, who are old enough to remember that, it completely altered all sorts of things about politics, about how we do things, about how we fly, how we interact with other nations, all sorts of things. A couple of years later, we had a heat wave in Europe that killed, it was later estimated, 30,000 people, 10 times as many as the Twin Towers. Most people don't even remember this heat wave. We certainly had no idea at the time that this was a slowly unfolding, large-scale natural disaster. And we had no understanding of the scale of that disaster. A more recent example of that is how slow we were to respond to the COVID crisis and the millions of deaths that we're now seeing. We don't know what to do with those numbers. So, we're told that some, at the height of the second wave, for example, the second/third wave in this country, we were seeing thousands and thousands of people dying every day. We didn't really know what to do with that information. It's not something we can grasp. We've now lost 130-something thousand people. That's several heat waves worth of lives. But we don't fully understand what that means. The climate crisis is threatening hundreds of millions of lives, if not billions of lives, depending on whether we take sufficient action in time and depending on which of the various models, projections actually happens with, tipping points and this, that, and the other. We don't really know, but it's going to be many, many deaths, but we're not impacted by those because they're too abstract. So another quirk of human thinking is that we tend to base our beliefs on, well, I'll tell you in a minute about some of the things that we base our beliefs on, but we tend to then reinforce our beliefs according to what they already are by selectively attending to certain kinds of information. So given a bias in our belief, we then tend to selectively focus on information that supports that belief. So if you have a belief about climate change already, if you already think that climate change is a problem and there's a strange patch of weather, it's very rainy, for example, or it snows unexpectedly, or it's frosty in the middle of April or something, some weird thing happens. If you think that climate change is a problem, you go, wow, the weather's really weird. This is climate change. There you go. They did say the weather was going to be really unstable. If you don't believe in climate change, then you're likely to take the opposite interpretation and say, there, see, it's cold. The earth is not warming. So depending on what your prior belief is, you take the same information and you interpret it differently, and you tend to use it to bolster your belief. So that's called confirmation bias. And that is a very, very strong bias in how people think. So we don't tend to base our beliefs really very much on factual information. We tend to base it on things that make sense to us. And there's a couple of other things I'll tell you about in a second. And so one consequence of that is you can't really get people to change by giving them information. So I've given you lots of facts, but if you weren't already persuaded about climate change, you're probably not really absorbing those facts. So they call that the deficit model, this notion that people believe a certain thing because they don't have enough information, and then you could correct their beliefs by pouring information into them. We now know that that's not really the case, that you don't really get people to change just by educating them. That can help. So I'm not saying we shouldn't try and educate people, but beating people over the head with facts by and large is not really going to get them to start to take this issue seriously. So what does get people to change? And why do people believe what they believe? So social psychologists are now starting to unearth quite a few things about the sociality of our beliefs, the fact that we tend to base our beliefs very much on what the people around us and the people that we trust and the people who are in our social networks about what they believe. And a really good example of that from a few years ago was Brexit, where people tended to line themselves up on either side of the Brexit divide, if you like, very much based on their kind of social networks, their political circles, their friends and their families and so on. And people tended to, again, show confirmation bias. So they tended to look for information about the consequences of Brexiting that supported whichever side they were on. And then they shared that among their social networks and everybody kind of agreed. And so when the vote came out and it was really neck and neck and very knife edgy, people were really surprised because they had really thought that most people believed what they believed. And, you know, the reason is that we had, you know, these echo chambers, as they call them, these, we tended to kind of be sharing information among our social groups. Now, another really good example of that is climate. And so people have looked at how people formulate their climate beliefs according to what social networks are in. And one of the really big determinants of people's climate beliefs is their political affiliation, whether they're on the conservative end or the liberal end of the spectrum, the right wing or the left wing. People who are on the conservative / right wing end of the political spectrum tend to be more skeptical about climate change. So they're skeptical that it's happening and or they're skeptical that if it's happening, it's caused by human activity. And people who are on the more left side of the political spectrum, so they're in the US, so this is a US slide, but we see the same thing in this country. If you're on a sort of Democrat or liberal end, you are more likely to be a climate believer. And not only is there this divide, but that divide has widened over the last decade or so. So as we get more and more information, it's not the case that these things are converging. If anything, we're getting more polarized. So our beliefs tend to be what they call socially constructed. We tend to get our information from the people that we trust. And that includes people who vote the same way as us and so on. So if you try to talk to people about climate change who are skeptical, you get various comments which are an attempt to protect people's own kind of psyche from information that they don't want to take on board. For example, if they are in the social network that's skeptical of climate change, they'll say it's a hoax. People are scaremongering. People are cherry picking the data. They're presenting only the worst of it. And they'll, point to selective articles and selective newspapers to reinforce that. So confirmation bias and so on. And they'll, and we now know, of course, that that social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook feed into that by detecting the kinds of information that people are gravitating towards and reinforcing that by feeding them more and more of it. So one of the big scandals that's come out about social media in the last few years is the way it radicalizes people by picking up on what their bias is and feeding them with more and more information to reinforce that bias. And so that's widening the divide. People will say the earth has warmed before, it's no big deal. And as I showed you, that's true, but it is a big deal because we're not adapted. It's never warmed as fast as it's warming now. Even when we were seeing those big fluctuations in the past, in a few million years ago, it never warmed in the space of a few hundred years. It usually warmed in the space of a few 100,000 or a million years or so on. So we've never done this before. We have plenty of time. So people say, yes, it's warming, but it's slow. The Earth system is a slow system. We've got plenty of time. Just calm down. Stop worrying. We actually know that by 2050, we are going to have exceeded the 1.5 level that the IPCC said was dangerous. And by the end of the century, we're going to be into a region of calamitous warming if we haven't done something pretty drastic by then. So that's within the lifespan of our children. It's 2021, so that's 80 years from now. There will be dangerous warming for the lives of our children. people say, yeah, it's true that that there are problems, but there's quite a lot of stuff that's being done. People are inventing things. There's people on the case. We've got all of these governments. We've got the IPCC. We've got the Paris Climate Accord. We've got targets. It's okay. People are taking action. Therefore, I don't need to. People say technology will fix it. We can plant trees. We can pull carbon out of the air with machines. We can do this, that, and the other. People will say, yes, it's true that the tropics are going to become uninhabitable, but in the northern regions of the US and the UK and so on, we'll be okay. It's temperate. So in fact, we could use a bit of warming. It'd be nice. We'll have a more Mediterranean climate and so on. And then if none of that works, people say, well, okay, we're going to go extinct, but we deserve to. We've had our time. It's time for us to step aside and let something else come along. So these are all forms of denial. So denial is a psychological mechanism that was identified by Sigmund Freud first in the kind of early 1900s, and we now we know that it's something that people do to protect themselves from information that is going to cause them anguish that they can't really do anything about. And a really classic example is if somebody receives a cancer diagnosis and they're told that it's terminal, they will frequently just deny it. They don't want to know. They will pretend that nothing has happened, that they're fine. And every doctor who's treated patients will have seen that there's a few, a relatively small number, but people who simply right up to the end of their lives will not believe that there's anything wrong with them. So it's a protective mechanism in as much as it lets us get on with the business of daily life, making sure that we feed our children and do those things that we need to do to propagate the species and so on. So it's a defensive mechanism, but it was a useful defensive mechanism when we lived in the savannah and what we were denying is illness. It's not a useful defensive mechanism when we are in a globalized, planetary system, and what we're denying is collective activity that's going to bring about a catastrophic global change. So we need to do something about our denial. So another psychological trait or way of thinking that is really getting in the way of doing anything is this scenario called the tragedy of the commons. So this is a really brilliant name for a well understood scenario. It's called that because of this paper that was written in the 1960s by Garrett Hardin. It was published in one of the top science journals. And the reason that it was published in such a big name journal is that he actually quantified mathematically this situation, but we can understand it in a kind of a intuitive way. So the tragedy of the commons comes about when you have a bunch of people who are sharing a resource. And in the scenario that he outlined in this paper, he said, imagine you've got people who are raising, actually it was goats, but this picture shows a sheep because I found a picture of sheep, raising animals on the village common, which is grassy, and there are several herds people and they've all got their animals. And the commons are starting to get degraded. There are too many animals and the grass is not doing so well. And it's quite clear that if everybody continues to graze all their animals, that it's going to sort of disappear and then there won't be any grass for any of the animals. And everybody can see that this is a problem, a collective problem. But Hardin took us through the reasoning of every individual and said, from the point of view of each individual herder, when they put another animal on the common, they get the benefits of that animal for their family. They get the benefits of an entire animal. And yet the destruction of the common gets shared among everybody because the common land is shared. So they get all of the benefits, but the negatives are shared. So they only get a little bit of the negatives. So the plus minus, the cost benefit analysis says they should put their animal on there. And the same reasoning applies to every herder. For every herder, the cost benefit says, I should put another animal on there because I will get the benefit and I distribute the cost. And of course, the problem is that everybody does that. Everybody puts an animal on there, the commons degrades and everybody loses all of their animals. So the climate crisis is a really good example. It's what they call a commons scenario. And a typical thing that that people will say when you start talking about what we can do about the climate crisis is a very typical commons scenario comment. So they might say something like, well, what about China? So we could rein in our own emissions, but we would be the ones that suffered. We would get all of the detriment of that. And so it's kind of like turning the commons scenario on its head. We get all of the detriment of that, and the benefit is shared among everybody. We only get a small percentage of the benefit. So really, it doesn't make sense for us to kneecap our own economy because, and people always refer to China. What about China? Because China is so huge and it's the biggest emitter globally. And so people say, there's no point us doing anything because what about China? Now, for one thing, China actually, if you look at the per capita emissions, is not the biggest emitter in the world. In fact, the UK and the US are the biggest emitters per capita. But that's not the point. The point is that that kind of reasoning where we shouldn't do anything because we don't want to bear all of the detriment that would bring to ourselves. All of the countries, because they're collectively all doing that same thing, that is a lethal form of reasoning, and we somehow have to get around that. Now, how do we get around that? Well, what we need to do is to understand that that ultimately individuals and nations will act in their own best interests. So you somehow need to make it in our best interests to act in a climate positive way. And the fact is that although we've evolved this kind of selfish reasoning, if you like, we have also evolved quite a large ability to act cooperatively. And in fact, we're one of the most cooperative species that is known on the planet. Humans are really, despite all the wars and all the conflict and all of the really negative stuff we're constantly hearing about, in fact, we are more cooperative than almost any other species. We have this extraordinary capacity to work with strangers. So I know almost none of you, for example, and yet here we all are working together in this common cause, trying to make a better world. We're working together. We are, friendly. We smile at each other. We're able to jam together on public transport without fist fights, by and large. We're able to contribute our taxes to the common good, and so on and so on. So how can we do that? Well, the reason is that we have social contracts, which mean that we know that for our individual sacrifice, we will get something back. So we have reciprocity. And if we have reciprocity, if we trust the people that we're working with, we trust that if we put something into the common good, we will get the benefit back as well. Then we can overcome these other more kind of selfish tendencies that we have. So the tragedy of the commons was a very kind of gloomy view of humanity. And in fact, there are many situations in which we've overcome that reasoning by collective working for the common good. So we need to, when we tackle this, we need to make people understand that if they make individual sacrifices, they will see the benefits of that. Now, the way that we distribute benefits to individuals is through government. So what we need to do is to have a combined bottom-up and top-down approach. We need individuals to change their behavior, and we need governments to make individuals benefit from that change in behavior. So that if I do something like change my gas boiler at great expense to an electric boiler, which I haven't done yet, it's on my to-do list, I need to know that I'm going to get some benefit for that expenditure somehow. I need to feel that I'm not the only person doing this, that my friends and neighbours are doing this, that the person down the street who I don't know is doing this, the person on the other side of London is also doing this, that we're all doing this. And the reason I know that is because government has incentivized it somehow. They've either they've given us tax breaks to make it happen, or they've made laws that say we have to do it, or they've done whatever it is that governments do. So we need bottom-up and top-down approaches. So in terms of bottom-up approaches, the biggest thing that we can do as individuals is change our own lifestyle, because we are a social species. We do shape a lot of our behaviors according to what we see our neighbors doing and our friends doing. So you're not going to change your friends and your neighbors by pointing the finger and saying, you should stop eating meat, you should stop doing this, you should stop doing that. But if you just quietly change your own lifestyle and tell people that you've done that. Post it on Facebook. Just not on a, hey, everybody should do what I do, but just quietly do it. And you know, let people know you've done it. Park your new electric car on the street where other people can see it. You know, put your solar panels where people can see them, and so on. Do things that let other people know that you've done that. So that's one thing you can do. And when people start seeing other people doing it, they start to go, okay, so this is a thing we're all doing now. You can talk to friends and colleagues. You can't beat them over the head, and it certainly doesn't work to humiliate people or to argue with people. But if you sense that somebody is sort of starting to think about these things, encourage them to talk, encourage them to share maybe their hesitations. Why are they not putting solar panels up, or why not doing this or not doing that? Why haven't they, you know, gone vegetarian or something? Just talk to them, be friendly, be gentle, listen to them, talk to the public and talk to schools. So go out and do what I'm doing now. Talk to your church group, to your book club, to this, that, and the other. Offer to give talks to your kids' class. You know, put it out there that we need to be doing something, and you know, fight for the future of humanity. Now, the top-down approach is that we need to get government to change. Ultimately, governments really only care about themselves. Governments are selfish agents, just in the same way that all other humans are. They want to be voted in. So write to your MP, because your MP cares about your votes. So when I talked to an MP, our MP about this, Anne Main, last year or the year before, she said, look, my inbox is not full of people complaining about the climate. It's full of people worried about the potholes. So we need to make our MPs think we're worried about the climate. You need to go to your MP, turn up at their surgery, write letters, make them understand that you, the constituent, the voter, really care about this, and get your friends to write to them as well. Talk to them, lobby Parliament. If you have to, protest. One of the things about Extinction Rebellion, so the year that I was involved, it made some huge changes in, for example, it got government to declare a nationwide climate emergency. And the reason is that ordinary people piled out into the streets, like people like me, people who have, you know, who are normal staid citizens who don't look like the kind of person who's normally an activist. It was people like us who got out there into the streets. And the reason is that we were really upset and worried. And the government saw that, and everybody else saw that, and it really had an effect. So protests do have an effect. If nothing else is working, it makes people understand that there's a strong amount of feeling about this. And then other people will start to change too. And what we really want is to create a social tipping point, ultimately. So, you know, basically, that's what we need to do to protect our little pale blue dot. It's the only home that we have. It's our only planet, and it's very precious. And humanity is a precious thing. We are an amazing species. It would be really sad to see us go extinct. And I really think that we have the potential to work collectively. We just need to make it happen. And that's up to you guys. And I hope we will manage it. So thank you. Okay, I'll share it at that point.
Thank you very much. That was riveting. Actually, it's really, really interesting. Thank you, Kate. I'm not seeing any questions as such, but if people, rather than writing in the chat thing, would like just to put their hand up, I could bring them in. Just to ask a quick question. I mean, actually, I was corresponding by email with a resident today. I was trying to encourage him to look at our Count Us In page that we've set up with Redbourne Climate Action. I assume you're familiar, are you, with the Count Us In page, Kate? Is that?
I'm actually not. No.
Oh right. Well, it's sort of it's a website. St Albans District Council is also doing it, where you can nominate something to do, just something small, like turning your heating down a little bit, or eating less red meat, or not throwing your clothes out until you really have to, and wearing them longer. So it's you know, it's addressing things at a small level. In a way, it fits into what you were saying, really, about sort of the bottom up, really. But that did prompt a reply from a resident who I was trying to encourage to do it. he did the usual arguments. Well, there's always been climate change, and the Thames used to freeze over and all the rest of it. But he was arguing that the main problem is overpopulation, which obviously is an issue. Is there anything you could say about that?
Yeah, so people often point to overpopulation, and so there's various things to say about that. So one of the issues is that it's not population per se, but the consumption of the population. So it's not so much the number of people on the planet as how destructive we are. So the typical person in the industrialized world contributes, maybe, I forget the exact number, but it's many times, it's something like 100 times the destruction in terms of carbon and in terms of land use and so on, as a subsistence farmer in Africa, for example. So industrialized population is way more, the footprint, if you like, is much bigger. So doing something about population in and of itself is not going to be as quick as doing something about our consumption, about our ecocidal lifestyles. Population will population seems to start to decline once people become wealthy. So once they actually feel secure and they have enough to eat and they have spare time, they don't have to spend every minute of every day working and so on, they tend to limit their own family size so that they can do other things. And in fact, we are starting to see downturns in populations of the wealthiest countries. So it's quite possible that population will self-stabilize once we've lifted the poorer nations out of poverty, but we need to reduce collectively everywhere the destructiveness of the way that we live. So that's the answer to population, I think, is population is not the real problem, it's destructiveness.
Okay, thank you. Now in the chat, I've got a message here saying that Gavin has a question. Do you want to ask your question, Gavin?
Yes, if you don't mind. Kate, there was a programme on the BBC, which is now on the iPlayer, which was the People versus Climate Change. Did you have a chance to see it at all?
No.
Okay, that kind of torpedoes the question somewhat. It's interesting because it picks up on a number of the points you make in terms of the psychology. It was basically, I'm sure quite a few people in the audience know, 108 people selected at random from the British population to be a representative sample to discuss climate change, to help the government come up with policies. But what was fascinating was precisely what you picked on, which is the entire different spectrum of opinion. So one chap was saying that sea levels have only risen by a metre. That's not very much. And someone else was saying that wipes out entire countries. So it was just fascinating. I thoroughly recommend anyone to watch the programme. I've done speaking. I think Ali's got her hand up.
I'll go and check it out. So that's at Citizens Assembly, I guess, was it?
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea, I think.
Thank you. Right, I'll come to Ali in a moment, but I've got a question from Dennis. Does Kate think capitalism is a factor?
So a lot of climate activists are really quite anti-capitalist and feel that it's the root of the problems because, capitalism has multitudes of problems. So it's one of the things that's driving industrialization and consumption, consumerism and globalization and the widening of the gap between the rich and the poor and the rise of the super rich and all of these things. There are many bad things to say about capitalism. But also, I think it's one of the, I may be a small minority among climate activists, but I think it's one of the great inventions of civilization too, because I think what capitalism has done, well, certainly, money, if in the crudest form of capitalism, what the invention of money has done has meant that we are able to work cooperatively with people with whom we have nothing in common. So, one of the reasons we can cohabit equitably with other nations is because we have these economic relationships where we're trading things via money. So money has enabled us to put in place systems that let us do things like beat COVID, beat the COVID, develop vaccines and all of this kind of stuff. So capitalism has done many bad things and it's done many good things. And I think I don't see how we can solve the climate crisis without using capitalism. It's our only tool for all its multitudes of flaws. It's the only real tool that we have for getting everybody across the globe kind of on the same page with what needs to be done. It's the kind of great leveler. We all understand money. We all are trying to get more money. So I think we need a capitalist solution of some sort. Whether it's to do with carbon pricing or some type of incentivization, monetary incentivization that gets nations everywhere to decarbonize. I think ultimately whatever we do is going to have to involve that. I bet a lot of people think we just got to scrap capitalism, start again with something else.
Okay, Ali, you've got a question.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, yes.
Good. I suppose something I'm interested in is your kind of view of the challenge of climate change being a problem that requires kind of a long-term horizon. And I wondered if there's any lessons that we can learn from how society sort of changed perceptions around smoking. And particularly, I think, in the early days, kind of tobacco firms put out a lot of research that challenged the kind of the state, the perceived wisdom of the health impacts of smoking, and just those few naysayers or counterpoints created enough doubt in a lot of people's minds. And I think there's similar with climate change, that there's a few people funding research that puts the seed of doubt in. And so as soon as you don't have a consensus, you have a much bigger uphill battle. And I just wondered, obviously there was that volte-face around smoking. Is there anything we can learn from that to then apply to climate change?
Yes, I think so. The tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry have a lot in common in terms of how they've tried to flog what's essentially an extremely dangerous product using very sophisticated advertising. And as you say, they sow seeds of doubt. They get people hooked on the product. They then do this thing where when it slowly starts to seep through the public perception that this is a problematic product, they then start to look as though they're going to become part of the solution as well. Like, for example, starting to manufacture vaping products and so on. So they keep people hooked on nicotine, but just through a different form. And we see the same thing with fossil fuel industries, where they do this thing called greenwashing, where they make it look like they're taking climate change very seriously, and they're starting, so long as we keep buying BP products or Shell products or whatever, we will, we'll be helping to solve climate change because they're doing all of this stuff and so on. And so they're using the same tactics, and also people buy into it because they themselves like the products, and so they go through those same psychological things if they don't really perceive the risk, or they don't think that they themselves are going to experience the risk. So I know lots of people get lung cancer, but I'm not going to get lung cancer. So I've smoked for years and I'm fine, so I'm going to keep doing it. Or got to die of something, or whatever. They go through whatever mental machinations that enable them to keep smoking because that's what they're addicted to. That's what they want to do. And it's very difficult to get people to give up smoking, and it's been very difficult to suppress the tobacco industry. We haven't succeeded. It's still a thing. So I think we can learn from it. But one of the things we're learning is it's very difficult to get people to take these messages on board. And really, again, we need governments to be courageous and to do what they haven't done with tobacco, and to just say, look, we need to take action. And I know it's not going to be popular, but this is what we have to do.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions on the chat now. From Susan, who says, the tragedy of the commons came up in a recent webinar on climate change, and the economist giving the lecture came down in favour of a carbon tax. What are your thoughts on the polluter pays?
So, I mean, I'm not au fait with all of the arguments for and against. On the face of it, it seems like a good idea, possibly even a necessary thing. It's hard to imagine a solution that doesn't involve financially penalizing people who burn, put carbon into the air. But there are some problems with it. So one of the implications is, therefore, if you have enough money, you can continue to produce carbon because you can afford it. So that means that the people who have money will continue to pollute, and the people who don't have money will be the ones who are paying the price. So I think there are some complexities around just a carbon tax as opposed to some stronger penalty. But I think ultimately, I suspect that the solution is going to involve something along those lines, at least partly. But there may be people in the audience who have more knowledge about this than I do who want to speak up.
Is there anybody that wants to chip in? Okay, I've left a pause, so I'll go on to a question from.
No, I
Hello?
do agree there are problems with it. And in fact, during this lecture, we were shown pictures from Australia and a great deal of opposition to the idea of carbon tax. And I think Macron, with his policies bringing about the Gilets jaunes protests, that was connected in some way, I believe, with the concept of the polluter pays. So there is a good deal of opposition to it. It's not straightforward, but I just wanted to open the debate, really.
Okay, thank you, Susan. If anybody wants to pick up on that, then obviously you can do so, but I'll come on to Dennis Harvey's question, which is, given the continual rise in greenhouse gases, how many years does Kate think we have before it is run away and too late to act?
Well, the climate scientists that I've talked to say it's never too late to act. It's just that the longer you leave it, the worse things get. I mean, one of the problems with this is that it's not reversible. So, as carbon dioxide levels rise and the Earth warms, a lot of that heat is getting pumped into the oceans. So actually, things have warmed a lot less than they kind of should, if you like, because we have so much water on this planet that water's got a very high capacity to hold heat. So you pump a lot of energy into water to get it to rise just a little amount in temperature. But the flip side of that is, even if you stop warming the Earth, there's all this heat in the ocean still to come out. So even if we stop warming the Earth, it's going to take a very long time before we get temperatures back down to the pre-industrial baseline. And the longer we wait, the longer it's going to be. Now, some people think that there are these tipping point things, that we're going to go off a cliff edge, and the longer we leave it, the more there's a risk of things like that happening. But I'm not sure that most climate scientists really think that the cliff edge is a likely thing. It's more just a sort of exponential, worsening thing. Things just getting worse and worse, faster and faster and faster. So the sooner we act, the better, but it's never too late to act. So there's never a point at which we give up and say, well, if we can't do anything now, let's just party to the end. There's always time to do something.
Thank you. I've got no more questions in the chat. Is there anybody that wants to ask anything? If not, I can bring the session to a close. Thank you very much, Kate. Oh, there's somebody chipping in?
Yeah,
Dawn. Yeah, I've just got your hand up now, yeah.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I did miss the last little bit. I was just wondering if you guys are familiar with the form of carbon pricing in the United States, advocated by Citizens Climate Lobby. where they return. It's not really a tax in the sense that it doesn't, like, the money isn't taken and added to the government budget. It's actually returned to every household, but not to corporations. And that's, I don't know, I think that model might work really well because it, like I said, it doesn't incentivize corporations, and their bill also it takes into account people with really low incomes, and like they have measures that it wouldn't affect their the government aid that those people get, even with this dividend coming from the carbon price.
Right. So, but has that actually had a measurable effect on the emissions of big okay.
Well, we haven't passed it. We're trying to pass it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But the models, I mean, we have economic models that show that it would, because we would increase the price over time.
Well, it would be a really interesting experiment. I mean, I can imagine some of the really big polluting companies, you know, airlines and so on, would just say, okay, that's just what we have to pay to be able to carry on doing what we're doing. You know, because some of these corporations have such enormous profit margins that they can just afford it. But if it even has a partial effect, I think that would be great. You know, like I said before, I do think some type of carbon tax is probably going to be part of the solution. So if they do bring this in, it'd be really interesting. I hope it does have an effect.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any more questions?
Hiya. It says I'm still Ali, but I'm just his wife sat next to him. I'm really interested in your description of the necessity of the kind of change in social norms effectively, and the fact that people behave based on what their neighbour or their friend or family are doing. And again, I guess it's just interesting to think you can see that happening at a really small scale, but it relies on small scale change happening everywhere, not just like St Albans, Redbourne and Harpenden, but like, as you discussed, like China, Shanxi province, etc. And I guess, like, whose responsibility is it? I mean, it's all of our responsibility, but who is best placed to try and be triggering that change in social attitudes? And again, you can kind of look and see places where that has happened, not necessarily on climate, but on other issues, where you see kind of some of the British Social Values Survey shows over like decades, you see massive shifts in kind of some of our liberal views around same-sex marriage and issues like that, which have been completely normalized. And it's interesting to look at what's driven those changes and what can we learn from that about how we might try and drive change on these issues. But back to that question of like, who is best placed to do so and with what kind of authority or responsibility? And I'd just be really interested on where that change might come from, because it's given the gloomy picture that has been painted, that's our best hope, isn't it, for a kind of a broader change across attitudes?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert. I need to say I'm not a social psychologist. I'm a rat psychologist. But I do think that it so that bottom up thing is really sort of a grassroots thing. So I think the moment people felt that things were being sort of engineered by some type of authority for them, they wouldn't respond well to that. No, I think people, like if they were told they couldn't eat meat, for example, I think people would be pretty angry. But if they see that their friends, they've all gone out for dinner and their friends have all ordered vegetarian food, and they sort of noticed actually hardly anyone around me seems to eat meat much anymore. I think that type of thing can kind of propagate, because people worry about what other people think of them. So I don't know. So I think that there's a lot of power in grassroots, just spreading things from person to person to person across the society. but then at the same time also focusing upwards to the, you know, to get the top-down change, right? We're doing our bit. You, the government, you have to do stuff as well. You need to stop building coal mines. You need to stop doing this. You need to stop doing that. You need to bring in the law to tax aviation fuel. You know, there's all of these things we want you to do as well. But I think if we started asking the government to impose behaviours on people, that might backfire.
I think one of the things that when I was talking about the Count Us In website earlier, I might have said count me in, but it's Count Us In, and you can just search it and it'll come up. It's surprising, having done it, that you feel you are actually doing something by simply. I said the one thing I would do is turn my heating down a little bit and put my warmer clothes on if I have to, and things like that. And all of a sudden you feel part of something, and that's the whole idea. And it fits into your, you know, how we approach this, the global warming issue, from the psychological aspect, if you like. It's that sort of encouraging people to be part of something bigger, but by doing something small themselves. And rather than thinking, well, there's no point in me changing my car to an electric car because what you know, it's a lot of fuss, and you know it's costly and all the rest of it. But if it's just a question of saying that you know, I'm a meat eater, say, but I'm going to cut it out of my diet as much as possible, then obviously, you know, you register this on the website, so it starts to feel as though you're doing something as a community and not just as an individual where it doesn't make much difference.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes, Susan Vinther, is that correct? I've pledged not to buy any new clothes for 3 months on that site. I'm now 2 months through, so it's obviously working. Oh, there's the question from Dennis. Does Kate think the United Nations has a role to play?
Oh, I don't know. I think every sort of organization that we can think of probably has a role to play, particularly ones that, you know, cut across nations. I think, you know, ultimately we're going to have some type of global, maybe not global government, but some type of global body that can mediate, you know, the interests of the sort of various countries and create the kind of sense of collective action. So the UN might be a good vehicle for that. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. And I've got a message that Caroline has a question. Is Caroline? Yep.
No, I don't have a question.
Oh, right. Okay. I don't know.
I could make an observation that with Kate was mentioning how a lot of people's reaction is, well, what about China? I think one reaction to that could be, do they know that the Chinese power stations that are being financed largely by Western banks, by about half that money comes from the countries like ours that are financing that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Thank you. Any other questions or anything that anybody wants to say before this time? I will wrap it up. In the chat line, there's a few website addresses, and including the St Albans District's Count Us In, and a Facebook page for Extinction Rebellion St Albans, and on Wednesday evening 14 to 26-year-olds have a chance to ask questions of our local politicians. So if you want to take a look at the chat, you'll see the links there. So yeah, one or two other comments there, but it looks like a lot of statements there rather than questions. So thank you very much then, Kate. It's been a fascinating evening, very interesting to hear. It's made me think about how the psychology of addressing climate change is as important as anything else, isn't it? Something that I hadn't been aware of. I was aware of graphs and the increased temperature and all the rest of it, and some of the reasons for that, but thinking how we deal with it from a psychological point of view is actually, it has been fascinating. So thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much, Joe, and also to Melanie. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
Have
you.
a good evening. I was just waiting for people to leave, but they're doing so slowly. Yeah, it was really good. It's really interesting, fascinating presentation there, Kate. Really interesting.